I run In May, which is a sustainable slow fashion brand where I make everything to order here in my home studio. I've been sewing on and off my whole life, but I learnt how to sew properly in 2019 when I was trying to make my own clothes for a music festival. I'm completely self-taught and I've made a range of different styled pieces throughout the last 6 years of my sewing journey. So if I can do it, you can do it too. In this video, I'm going to walk you through step by step the things you'll need before you start sewing, things to practice, the techniques you'll use, the tools you'll need, the different types of machines there are, and all about fabrics. And hopefully I'll also answer some of your questions that you may have about sewing. Towards the end of this video, I'm going to walk you through your first sewing project, which is a scrunchie, which is super easy to make, and then also a tote bag, which you can purchase the pattern for on my website. Both of these are really great beginner-friendly sewing patterns that you can start with. I'm going to leave timestamps for everything in the description, so if you're just coming back to watch the tutorials, you can just go down below and click those down there, or if you're just after specific questions or anything, there'll be timestamps down in the description for you to click through to. I'm going to be speaking to you as if you are a complete beginner and you have no idea about sewing at all. So if you already know some of these tips that I tell you about, feel free to skip through to the parts that you would like to learn more about. Before you begin your sewing journey, you're going to need a sewing machine. But what kind of sewing machine should you buy? Where should you buy them from? How much should you spend on a sewing machine? And what are the things that you should be looking for? I think it's important to figure out how much you're wanting to spend on your sewing machine, as well as how often you're going to be using it, what kind of projects you'll be making, and what types of fabrics you'll be using in those projects. It's super important to figure out what type of projects and fabrics that you're going to be working with, because some machines are more durable and heavy duty compared to others. So for example, if you want to make handbags out of leather, you probably won't be able to do this with a generic everyday sewing machine because it may not be able to get through that thick of a material. Some definitely can, but you may just have to do a little bit of research and make sure that the machine that you're using is capable of doing those types of fabrics. Same as if you want to work with chiffons or silk or any type of really thin fabric, you want to make sure that your machine is suitable for using and working with those fabrics. Sewing machines can become very expensive, so it's always a good idea to talk to a professional and do some research before you go out and purchase one. I don't actually like to recommend sewing machines because I've only worked with a couple and my experiences may be different from other people's, and other people may think that their machines are 10 times better than mine. It's all about personal preference. It also just really depends on the different types of projects that you're using your machines for. Now, most machines should have these, but in the odd case that they don't, these are the things that you definitely should be looking out for when purchasing your first sewing machine, and that is a straight stitch, which is the basic straight stitch that you're going to be using on the majority of your projects. A zigzag stitch is really helpful if you don't have an overlocker, which I'll talk about later. You can use a zigzag stitch instead of an overlocker to overlock your edges, and you can also use it for knit fabrics and stretch fabrics, those types of things. And another stitch that isn't really necessary, but it is always good to have, is a buttonhole. Most sewing machines should be able to do it, but it's not the end of the world if you can't get that on the sewing machine that you've decided to choose. Buttonholes are just really good if you decide that you're going to make like a button-up shirt and you want to add buttonholes, or if you want to do a pair of shorts that have drawstrings in them, then you can use that. You also want to make sure that your machine can do back stitches, has different tension settings, stitch length settings, different presser foots, and speed adjustments for sewing is also really handy. Most domestic sewing machines should have all of these, as well as a few other stitch settings, and sometimes they may also have things like an automatic threader or an automatic thread cutter, but these are normally on more expensive machines. The machine that I learnt on is my mum's like 40-year-old sewing machine, and it's called the Janome SW 2018E. It still works. I haven't used it in a while, but it has everything that I needed for when I first started my sewing projects. It's sturdy, it has the basic stitches, it has different presser foots, back stitch option, and it's a really great machine to learn on. I'm not saying to go out and try and find this machine and buy it as your first one, but I'm just showing that you don't really need a brand new machine. You can use an old machine, and you also just need the basics to get you started with your sewing projects. So if you don't have a budget for a new machine, you can go out and find a second-hand one, either through an op shop, on Facebook Marketplace, eBay, all sorts of places. The machine I use now for my business is the Juki HZL F600, which is a really expensive machine, and look, I love it. It's fantastic. It is a beast, but I did buy it wanting to use a lot of the quilting and applique options on it, and I just really don't, and it's definitely more of like a quilter's machine. It has those options, so I don't really want to recommend it, especially if you're a beginner sewer, because it is a very expensive machine. But if you're someone that is wanting to do quilting or those types of things professionally, or even if you're doing a business professionally, I do recommend that machine because I love it and it's fantastic. It's super fast, it's super sturdy, it's super strong. I've never had any problems with it. It's just amazing. So I will recommend it, but not as a beginner's machine. Definitely if you're someone who's been sewing for a while, and maybe if you want to do quilting professionally, or you want to do a sewing business professionally in any way, it's a good machine for that. These are just the sewing machines that I use or I have used, and I definitely recommend my Juki, but definitely for someone who is more of an intermediate sewer or maybe has their own business and they're looking at upgrading their regular sewing machine to something that's a little bit more stronger and faster, then I would definitely recommend it. I love it so much, but as a beginner, maybe just hold off on that one because it is quite expensive. If you're just starting out, then I recommend looking into a machine that is similar to my Janome that I was talking about before. It just has those basic stitches and everything that I was discussing earlier on. It's best to do some research before you go and buy a sewing machine, so make sure you go and talk to some professionals, or you jump online and do some Googling of the brands that there are. So Janome, Brother, Singer, there's heaps out there, as well as the types of sewing machines that those brands have. Where to buy? So there are heaps of places in Australia, online, around the world where you can buy sewing machines from. I recommend going into a physical store and seeing what sewing machines they have, as well as their price range and maybe even the size of the sewing machines. You don't want to order something online and realize that it's tiny and probably won't be able to do the projects that you thought it would do, or it was way too big and you only have a small space. So definitely go into a store like Spotlight or another sewing machine stockist that stock Janome or Brother or Singer or another type of good brand sewing machine, and you can easily find these with a quick Google search. I bought my Janome Overlocker 1200D from Hobby Sue, which is an online store, and I think that they also have multiple stores in different cities around Australia. And I bought my Juki from Sewing Machine Warehouse, which I think is in Sydney, and I think it's only online, and they mostly just do industrial machines. I'm not sure if they do that many domestic machines, but that's where I got it from. I also bought my Janome Mylock 644D from a local sewing stockist here in the Sunshine Coast, and it's just my replacement while my other overlocker gets fixed again. I obviously wanted to continue using Janome machines because I do think that they're really good and strong and sturdy. I have had no problems with my Mylock or my mum's old machine. They've both been great and fantastic to work with. I have had 2 issues now with my 1200 Professional D, and it's just because it has so many different mechanisms and everything on the inside going on, so I'm not sure if I could recommend it anymore. I do love it and it's really fast, but yeah, it's just I've had some issues with it. But my Mylock has been great and I really like working with it. If you don't live near somewhere that has a Spotlight or a sewing machine stockist, you can always try an op shop. Sometimes they have sewing machines in them. It is hit or miss. You may have a really old sewing machine that isn't super workable, or you may get a decent new-ish brand one that's in there that is pretty cheap. If you do happen to find one at an op shop, just ask while you're there if they can plug it in and just test to make sure that it is working while you're there, because you don't want to get home and see that it's not working. Or if they don't want to do that, just at least ask to say, hey, can I take it home, try it, and if it doesn't work, can I bring it back and get my money back? And then you also want to make sure that you go and get it serviced by a professional to make sure that everything is working, it's all oiled, and everything is in good nick. Another place you can buy sewing machines is online. You can look on Facebook Marketplace or eBay or just other secondhand websites, as well as shopping straight through a sewing machine stockist website like Hobby Sew, Sewing Machine Warehouse, or Spotlight. I'll quickly go over what an overlocker or a serge is while we're talking about sewing machines. If you're just starting out, you don't need an overlocker. I'll teach you how to finish your raw edges with just your domestic sewing machine. But if you're someone who has a business or is starting a business, or you're wanting to make your garments look really professional looking, then a serger or overlocker is a really good machine to have. Overlockers are a special machine that overlocks raw edges of fabric and can also trim off any excess fabric and threads. And it can bind pieces of fabric together to be more sturdy, and also can be a really helpful machine to use for knit and stretch fabrics. They're typically a lot faster than your regular sewing machine, so again, if you're new to sewing, maybe just hang on until you get the basics of sewing before you work with an overlocker. Unlike sewing machines which use 2 threads, so your top thread and your bobbin thread, to create a lock stitch, an overlocker uses 3 to 5. Most overlockers can do a rolled hem, which is really great if you're working with lightweight fabric, or you can also do a flat lock stitch with these, which is commonly used in activewear. Again, if you're brand new to sewing, you don't need an overlocker. I'll show you how to finish your raw edges with just a sewing machine. Once you have the basics down and you've been sewing for a while and you're ready to take your garments to the next level, then I would recommend looking at getting an overlocker. Now that you've got your sewing machine, there's a few tools you'll need to get before you start sewing. I've accumulated a lot of different tools over the years of sewing, but these are the tools that I use pretty much every single day. A seam ripper, sewing nippers or thread cutters, fabric scissors, measuring tape, and a loop turner. My best friend when sewing is my seam ripper. We're all human, we make mistakes. Sometimes your bobbin thread runs out and you have to unpick the stitches and restart, or you've sewed the wrong sides of the fabric together. Having this is so handy, and you also need it for other things like unpicking gathering stitches or basting stitches, or just fixing things on your garment. So this is super handy to have, and if you're a beginner, I highly recommend getting one of these. They're really cheap and they're so handy to have. My other most used item is my sewing nippers, thread cutters. They're just this little handheld sort of scissor, and it's super handy to have rather than trying to use your big scissors to cut all of your threads. And you only use this on cutting your threads from your sewing machine. You don't use this on cutting actual fabric because you will just end up blunting this. This is only for threads. You'll definitely need some fabric scissors, and you'll want to make sure that your boyfriend doesn't steal these and use them to cut paper or his hair or other things, because they'll blunt. Just fabric only. You can get really good quality ones. I have a better quality upstairs. These ones came in like a pack. I had like 3 or 4 of them. So you can get a set, and they're usually pretty cheap when you buy them in the set, and they're still really good quality. But I do have a more expensive one that's upstairs that is really great for cutting multiple layers of fabric at a time. You'll need pins to help hold all of your fabric layers together, and I recommend getting some good quality ones, and also getting some ones that don't have that little pin on the end, because if you pin these into your fabric and then iron over them, they're not going to melt. I think these ones melt onto the fabric, so definitely don't iron over those ones. You can iron over these ones though. Another thing that you can also do instead of pins is also get these like little quilter clips. These ones are really small, you can get bigger ones as well, but if you're going over a lot of layers of fabric and your pins are struggling to go through the fabric, you can use these instead. I should have bigger ones, but I've got these really tiny ones. It's also really handy to have measuring tape. I have had a really good tip where you can just kind of glue this or sticky tape this to your table, so then when you're measuring out things, you don't have to like try and scramble to get this. You can just measure it directly on the table. I just prefer to have it with me. But I also use this little thing as well, which is called a sewing gauge, I think, and you basically just can move this little red thing here to kind of sit at what number you want it to. what measurement you want it to. And I use this for when I'm measuring out my hems, or I also use it for measuring out my darts, those types of things. It's just really handy to have, and then it's also a smaller measuring device, so you don't need to be using the tape all of the time. This is a loop turner, and it is so handy to have this if you're someone who is wanting to make things with straps, or I think you can even use them for like scrunchies or just things that you need to turn inside out. It is super handy to have. I also sometimes use it to like poke the corners of like pants or things that need to have pointed corners. I just use the end of this to poke it out because it's really small and tiny. But this is so handy to have for those things. Instead of using this, you can also just use a safety pin, but it does take a lot longer. This is so much quicker to use. Another thing that I didn't show that just then is also probably having a needle, like a hand needle, to just use. Occasionally you might have to do some hand sewing, so it's just always handy to have a hand sewing needle. Some other things you may need are rotary cutters and self-healing mats for your rotary blades to cut on, as well as a fabric marker or an air erasable marker, spare bobbins and spare sewing needles. There are different types of needles that you need for different projects and different fabrics, so make sure that you're checking what needle you need to be using and make sure that it is suitable for your sewing machine. It's more common that OVerlockers will have a different type of named needle that you need to be using, so make sure that you're checking on your machines what needle that machine specifically uses, because you don't want to shove some other needle in there and just completely break it and snap it. And also, if you're buying a lot of needles over time, they can add up and become very expensive. Also, when you buy your sewing machine needles, they usually come in packs that are either all the same size, or you can get a mixed pack. To know what size your needles are, you basically work off of, or how I work off of it is that the smaller the number, the thinner the needle is, and the bigger the number, the bigger the needle is. And depending on what fabric you're sewing and what type of project you're doing will depend on how thick or thin your needle needs to be. If you're working with really delicate fabrics like chiffon or lace or silk, you'll want to use a thinner needle, and if you're working with thicker woven fabrics like linen, then you'll probably want to work with a thicker needle. So if you're working with leather, or you're making jeans, or you're quilting, there are specific needles that are made for those types of fabrics, so make sure that you're not using your generic universal needles on those types of fabrics because you will break. Now that you have everything to start your sewing journey, let's begin with the basics. Get your machine set up, read the manual thoroughly, and get used to what all of the buttons and everything mean on your machine. I'm going to go over the parts of the machine and also teach you how to thread your machine, but remember that every machine is different and your threading system may be completely different from mine, so just make sure you read through your manual. Okay, so let's look at my sewing machine. This has a lot going on here, so let's just focus on the common parts that your sewing machine should have. You have the spool, which is where your thread sits. You should have a bobbin winder. These are the parts of the machine where the thread goes, and if you ever run into any issues with your thread, also check back in this section to see if it hasn't been threaded properly. This is where all the action happens, so you have your needle here, which can be removed by this little knob, your presser foot and the presser foot holder. You can change these depending on your stitches. This is the throat plate, and underneath here is where our bobbin and feed dogs are. The feed dogs are these little jagged bits that move as you sew, and they help to move the fabric around. On the side we have our thread cutter, and also I have an automatic threader on my sewing machine, which is really handy for getting the thread through the needle. At the back is my presser foot lever, which lowers or raises the presser foot. The other parts your machine should have is the hand wheel, which can help you when you need to go through parts very slowly. You should also have the thread tension dial, presser foot adjustment dial, speed dial, back stitch, and then all of your other buttons for your stitches. Here's how to thread your machine. Again, follow your instruction manual, as you may have a different sewing machine from me. Firstly, we'll wind our bobbin. Then once that's done, we'll place it into its casing by opening up the cover and threading it through the parts that our machine needs it to be. Then place the cover back on. Then you'll need to choose the needle that you need for your sewing project and insert that into place. Then we're going to lead the thread through these parts of your machine. Make sure it gets taken up in here and then bring it back down to the needle. Make sure it's notched to this part, and then you can go thread it through the front and pull it out to the back. Now you can twist the hand wheel toward you so that the needle goes down and takes up the bobbin, and there you go. And then all you have to do is add the presser foot, and that's it. Now that you've got your machine set up, it's time to start sewing. Before you go ahead and start cutting up your nice fabric, it's a good idea to go ahead and get some scrap fabric and start using it to do some straight stitches and zigzag stitches and just practice sewing. Just use some spare woven fabric. It's the easiest to use. If you don't have any lying around, you can always go to op shops and see if they have any scrap fabrics, or you can also use old pillowcases, or you can go to fabric shops and they usually sell little bundles of fabric in small quantities, and they're usually pretty cheap, so you can just use those and get a hang of practicing sewing. If your machine has a speed setting, start slow until you get the hang of it, and then you can build up the pace. If you struggle to sew a straight line, you can use a fabric marker and a ruler to draw a line in your fabric and try to follow this as best as possible. You want to also learn how to follow the grid lines on your machine. So on the plate, you should have these lines that indicate how far your needle is from the line. So if you're sewing a 2 centimeter seam or hem, that's what this little number means here. This is there to help you when you're sewing. If you're going to be making things with buttonholes, like using them for drawstrings or on button-down shirts, make sure you have a practice with this as well before doing it on your good fabric. Once you're confident with doing those stitches, I'll show you how to combine 2 pieces of fabric together. Put your fabrics together good sides facing, pin them together in place, and then you'll now sew a stitch along the edge of this. I typically do about a 1 centimeter to 1.5 centimeter seam allowance for these. Now you've joined these 2 pieces together, and this is now your seam. You can finish this edge a few different ways. You can take this to an overlocker and overlock the raw edge. You can do a zigzag stitch or another type of overcasting stitch. You can do a flat felt seam or French seams as well. I'm going to show you how to finish your seams using the zigzag stitch method, as well as how to do it as a French seam. If you're at the point where you're using an overlocker, you just have to overlock that raw edge with your machine. The first method I'll show you is the zigzag stitch. So what you'll have to do is iron down your seam so it sits nice and flat, and then we'll go back to the sewing machine and we will adjust our stitch length settings and our width settings on our zigzag stitch if needed. Then what we're going to do is sew a zigzag stitch basically from one end right down to the edge, and we want to put the needle so that it is as close to the edge of the fabric as possible, even going slightly over. This will help capture all of those threads and help it stop from unraveling and becoming all fluffy and all of the thread coming loose. Don't forget to back tack at the top and also when you get to the end, as this will help stop that thread that you've just sewn from coming loose. And then this is what it should look like. You may have a few threads come loose from the fabric, so you can cut those off, but otherwise it should be pretty secure and you shouldn't have any more thread coming loose after that zigzag stitch. For the French seam, we're going to cut off that excess fabric that's next to our seam that we've sewn. Then we'll go to the ironing board and we'll iron this flat, and then we're also going to flip it over and iron down that so that the sort of edge of the seam that we've cut off, that's kind of hiding in between those 2 layers. And then we're going to go back to the sewing machine and we're going to sew about a 0.5 centimeter or 1 centimeter seam going all the way down, and this will kind of hide all of those raw edges in between those 2 pieces of fabric. Remember to back tack on both ends because this will help stop the thread from coming loose, and then that's basically it. And now you just have to iron that back out so that it sits nice and flat against the body. And there you have it, you've finished a French seam. I really love how the look of this is, and it's a really secure way to finish your seams. You don't have any loose threads hanging out. Once you've gotten the hang of joining all of your seams together and just a practice of all of the basics, I'm going to show you a few techniques that I use pretty much every day when I'm making clothes for my customers. In some sewing projects, you may find that you need to pivot your fabric before you can continue sewing. You may have to do this on things that are more squared, like a pillowcase or a pencil case. To do this, what you need is to sew your seam regularly, and then once you reach the corner, stop sewing. Make sure you leave the needle in the fabric and then lift your presser foot up Now you can freely swivel the fabric in the direction you need, put the presser foot back down, and then continue to sew. Also, a tip, if you ever need sharp edges on corners like this, cut diagonally across the edge of the fabric, and this will allow you to have a nicer crisp edge when you poke that back out. Sometimes when working with stretch fabrics, knits, or thinner fabrics, you may find that the threads or seams aren't very straight and the fabric slips. To help stop this from happening, you can do a basting stitch, which can be hand sewn or on your machine. On your machine, you'll need to change the stitch length to a longer length, and you can also adjust your stitch settings. Pin your fabrics together and then sew a straight stitch slowly along the edge of your fabric. You can also give yourself a bigger seam allowance to help with keeping the fabrics in place. Once you get to the end, don't back tack and just leave this thread longer so then you can pull it out later on. Now you can reset your tension and stitch length and then begin sewing your seam. Back tack your main stitches on both ends, and once it looks good, you can remove the basting stitch by pulling on the long ends of the thread. If you find that it gets stuck, you can also use your seam ripper to pick it out. Similar to the basting stitch, you'll use this when you need to gather fabrics. Do the exact same method for the basting stitch, and you can also do 2 lines of these to help gather up more fabric evenly. Then before you sew your seam, pull on the ends of the thread and you'll gather up the fabric. Spread this around evenly and then you can sew your seams together. After you've done that, you can then remove the gathering stitches and you have a gathered piece of fabric. To sew a hem, figure out how big you want your hem to be and then fold over the edges into the inside of your garment so that it isn't showing. Measure out the width of the hem, pin it in place, and you can also go over with an iron at this point to help it look crisp and neat. When you are at the side that the seam is on, make sure it is all sitting flat to the same side so that it isn't too bulky. Once you've pinned your hem in place, go to your machine. Now you can sew your hem with a straight stitch. If you're working with knit fabrics or stretch fabrics, you'll want to use a zigzag stitch instead of a straight stitch so that when you stretch the fabric, it will be able to stretch the thread with it, because if you do it with a straight stitch, it will pull and break. Okay, now it's time to work on your first sewing project. So I'm going to teach you how to make a scrunchie first, and that's a pretty simple pattern to make. So I'm going to show you how to make that in this video, and you can adjust it however you like. And then I also have a tote bag tutorial attached to this video as well, and you can purchase the tote bag pattern on my website. It's just $5. We're going to start with the tote bag tutorial, and you just have to print out the pattern and then assemble it together. There is helpful instructions in the printout. Then once you've cut it out, you'll also need to get some fabric. I'm using this cotton fabric, which is this beautiful green stripe and green gingham. And then you'll just have to place that out on a rotary board or on a flat surface so you can cut the pattern out. I use a rotary cutter and a rotary board because it just makes life so much easier, but you can also just use scissors and pin your pattern onto the fabric. You're going to cut 4 of the tote pattern pieces in total, but I'm using 2 different types of fabric here because I want the lining to be that striped fabric and then the outer fabric will be this really cute gingham. So make sure that you cut 4 out so that you have 2 for the outside and 2 for the inside. If you want to use the same fabric, you can do that as well. And also don't forget to mark your notches. Don't cut too far down, just about 1/2 centimeter, just so that you know where those notches are. Once we've cut out our main bits of fabric, we're also going to cut out some pockets. So you can do as many pockets as you want. You can do 1, 2, or 3, or 4. I'm doing 3 for the purpose of this video, so I'll show you how to just sew 1 pocket and then also how to sew 2 pockets, or so that you have double. Also, don't forget to add your notches to the pockets as well. Give your fabric a quick iron so that it's all nice and flat and ready to begin sewing. I'm also going to show you how to do the hem for your pockets, because otherwise you'll have this raw edge just sticking up and it'll come all loose. We're going to do basically how we did our French seam earlier on, except we're just doing it on that one piece of fabric, and this will help hide all of that raw edge. If you have an overlocker, you can overlock that and then just do your hem as normal, but this is how I'm doing it because then we hide all of that fabric and you don't need to do a zigzag stitch or overlock it, and it's all nice and neat. So you just have to fold over your edge 1/2 centimeter or 1 centimeter and then fold it over again, and then just iron this all down. And you can also pin this in place if you need to help keep the fabrics in place, and just do this for all of your pockets, and then go to your sewing machine and just sew a straight stitch all along the edge there. You can do this about a 1 centimeter stitch width. Now we're going to go back to the ironing board, and we're going to fold all of those raw edges of our pockets into the inside of the pocket, so the side that you want facing the inside of the pocket, so it's all hidden, because otherwise if this is all sticking out, again, you're just going to have all of those raw edges coming loose and fraying in your bag. So we're going to fold those over about a centimeter or a 1/2 centimeter fold and iron them down so that they sit nice and flat. Go around and do this for all of your pockets as well, and then also if you need to pin these down to hold them in place, you can do that. If you ever find that that top corner where we just hemmed is kind of sticking out, you can also kind of fold it into itself. So fold it over how I am here, and then that top corner you just tuck underneath itself into like a little triangle, and that can help stop that edge from flicking up or having like the frayed edges come out. Taking our main fabrics now, so this is the fabric that I'm going to have on the inside of my bag, which is this nice striped color. If you're using the same color as your outside, just make sure you know which one's what. But basically this is going to be on the inside of my bag, and we're going to find where those notches are on our inner piece, and we're going to mark this with either a fabric marker or tailor's chalk, or if you don't have those, you can also just pin a little pin in those places. But we're just going to mark basically a straight line, or I just did dots just so that I know where the center of this bag is. And we're also going to do it for the pockets as well, so that we know where the center of the pockets are, and this will help us be able to line these up properly, because otherwise they might sit all funny in the bag. You're going to measure down about 1.5 inches from that top curve, and then we're going to pin our pocket in place. So this is where the pocket opening will be, and then all of those edges that we've just ironed, we're going to make sure that they sort of like flick underneath into the pocket so that they're hidden and you can't see them on the good side of the pocket. And we're just going to pin that in place, and then we're going to take it to our sewing machine and sew all the way around. You also want to make sure that you do this for your other side. If you're also doing 2 pockets, just make sure that you pin your pocket to the other inside of the fabric. If you're just doing 1 pocket, then you can just do 1. Going to our sewing machine, we're going to sew down our pockets now, and we're going to sew about a centimetre from the edge. So do a back tack, start doing a straight stitch, and then when we get to those little points, I normally have my presser foot about a little bit over the edge or just before my needle is in line with that point, and then I do the pivoting technique that I spoke about earlier on, and we just do this all the way around the pocket. Then once we get to the end where the opening is going to be, we're not going to close that off. We want to make sure that we leave that open because otherwise we won't have a pocket. And we're just going to do another pivoting technique again. So right to the edge of where the pocket is, get as close as you possibly can, and then pivot all the way back around. And then we're going to do the same thing all the way around again. If you can't get too close to the edge, just go as close as you can. You just want to make sure that you're as close as you can because otherwise the fabric will kind of stick up a little bit if you're not close enough, but do as close as possible and just have a practice at it and go nice and slow. It's pretty easy to do once you get the hang of it. Then once you get to the end, do the same thing, pivot, and then you're going to close off by doing a straight stitch and then a back tack just to close off all of your threads and make sure that they're nice and secure, and then cut off any loose threads, and now you have your pocket. Then we're going to repeat the same steps for the other side if you've decided to do 2 pockets, and then I'm going to show you how I also do a 3rd pocket on top of this one. Okay, if you want to do a 3rd pocket or a 4th pocket, we're basically going to do the exact same thing as what we did before, except we're going to measure down about 2 inches from the top of our first pocket that we did, and we're just going to line our other pocket up with the sides and pin them in place. If you need to use your fabric marker or tailor's chalk as well, you can also do that just to make sure that everything is nice and straight and in line, but my marker was still visible on my fabric, so it was pretty easy to use. Just make sure you pin all the way around, flick all of those edges in underneath so that you don't have any frayed edges sticking out, and then we're going to sew the exact same way that we did before. You may have to sew a little bit slower on this part just because you're going over a few more layers of fabric, so just make sure you have a thicker needle, and if you need to go nice and slow, you do that just so that you don't break any needles and that you're not bunching up any fabric either. And when you've done that, now you should have 2 pockets, and it's really handy to have this. I'm leaving the other side to just have 1 pocket. And then now we're going to connect the outer fabric to the inside fabric. So what we're going to do is we're going to pin along those curved edges with the good sides of our fabric facing, and just pin all the way around, and then we're going to do a straight stitch all the way around this curve, and it's going to be about 1 centimeter seam allowance. And this is what it should look like when it's done. And now we're going to go over to our iron, and we're going to iron our seams flat. I like to call this like the pinch method. So basically you just pinch where your seam is, and it should help you be able to iron those nice and flat. You can also iron the seams from the inside and push it to one side, and then flip it to the good side, and then iron it down so it's nice and flat again. Make sure you do this for both sides of your tote bag, so you've got 2 different pieces which you'll then join together in the next part. Now that you have your 2 sides of your tote bag, we're going to connect the sides together. So I start with the lining or the inside of my tote bag, and we're going to line up those outer straight edges and just pin them together. And then you're going to just sew a straight stitch all along the edge. You're going to do this for both of the sides. Just do the lining first, and then we're going to swap it over, and we're going to do the same thing for the outer side. And now that that's done, we're going to do the exact same thing for the outer fabric. So it should look like this at that sort of like top section. And we're just going to pin the outer fabric on that straight edge down together. Pin both sides down, and then you can go to your sewing machine and do a straight stitch. Don't forget to do the back tack at the top and the bottom to make sure that your thread doesn't come loose. Once you have finished all of those sides, it should look something like this. Make sure that you have all of your pieces on those side lengths separate so that they sit nice and easily in the bag. And then we're going to go and sew the bottom part of the fabric. With the lining, you're going to leave about 3 or 4 inches so that there is an opening, because we need that to be able to flip the bag inside out. With the outer fabric, you can close that off completely. So here's the lining fabric. As you can see, I started from that top corner. I sewed about 2 or 3 inches, and then I missed a bit, and then I sewed again. Make sure you also back tack both of those bits because you don't want them coming undone. Now those little corners that we've got missing here, they actually have a purpose. We're going to close them and this is going to square off the bag. So what you'll do is you'll kind of pinch the parts that don't have the seam and you'll pull them out, and then the sides that do have the seams, you're just going to line them up with each other. I like to flick one seam to the opposite side so that it's just easier to sew over, because if you have them sitting to both sides, it's a little bit harder for your needle to get through all of that fabric. So just pin that in place and then you can just sew a straight stitch, again back tacking from the beginning and at the end, and then you should have this little bit all fixed up, and then you can do that for all 4 corners. Next, we're going to find the opening in the lining fabric and we're going to go through and pull one side of the shoulder strap. So just one shoulder strap, you don't want to pull the other one. Just pull one through and we're going to flip it so that it's the right way out. And now we're going to take it and we're going to poke it back through and go through to the other shoulder strap, and you want to make sure that you have the good sides facing each other. That's why we pulled that shoulder strap back out, so that we could have it with the good sides on the outside, and then the shoulder strap that's still from the inside, it's still how it was before. So you have your seams all lined up and everything is nice, the good sides of the fabric are facing, and then just pin this in place. Flick your seams again so that they're not sitting on top of each other, because then it'll be a lot easier to sew over them. And we're going to sew this from the inside because it just is a lot easier. So you kind of have to have that fabric sitting to the side, just hold it to the side there and sew a 1 centimeter seam all the way around. Just go nice and slow, and when you get close to the edge, just keep kind of pulling that fabric back so that you can go all the way around. You're basically just going around in a circle. Once you've done that, it should look like this. So it's kind of a nice little circle hole. It's really easy to do this if you've got 2 different fabrics, because then you can tell which one is the lining fabric and which one is the outer fabric. We're going to go back through that opening there and pull the shoulder strap out, and you can make sure that this is correct, that you've done it correctly, because it should look like a bag or start to look like a bag. If you've sewed the straps back to front or anything, just unpick it and have another go at it. Now we're going to close that bottom hole, and we're basically just going to flick those raw edges to the inside of the lining and pin in place so that we can sew a straight stitch along that edge there, and then we'll basically be done. So a straight stitch along the edge there. Don't forget to do a back tack on the beginning and the end to make sure that this doesn't come undone. And then once you're also finished this, you can go to the ironing board and just iron everything so that it sits nice and flat, and then your bag will be finished. Here is the finished bag. It's super cute and super big. It's a nice little shoulder bag and you can fit so much inside, and then also you have the pockets on the inside. Next up, we're going to make a scrunchie. These are so easy to make, and it's really good if you have any scrap fabric lying around. So what you're going to do is you're going to measure out 5 inches by 24 inches. You can also change this depending on how much fabric you have, or if you want to do a smaller scrunchie or a bigger scrunchie. Basically, you just want to make sure that your width is around 4 to 5 inches, and then your length can be maybe 18 to 24, a little bit more if you want it to be a little bit more fluffier as well. But you're just going to cut out one strip of those, and then we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to sew those raw edges down so that you have your first little seam. Once you've sewed down that seam, you sort of have this circle shape, and what we're going to do is that fabric that is facing you with the seam, you're just going to fold it into itself so that it's out of the way, and then that bottom part there we're going to fold all the way over to the top of the other side, and we're going to pin that in place, and then we're going to be sewing a straight stitch all the way along the edge. This is going to start creating a bit of a tube, and then as we sew we're just going to pull at that inside fabric so that we can create our scrunchie. Going to your sewing machine, we're going to sew about a 1/2 centimeter or a centimeter seam allowance along that long edge there, and as you can see, when we get towards that end we're going to have to pull that inner fabric out, and this is going to start creating a bit of a tube for our scrunchie. So make sure that you've pushed all of that fabric on the inside to one side, and then you can pull it all out and then begin sewing your straight stitch, and you're just going to keep doing this all the way until you get just before the end. When we get close to the end, we're going to leave about 1 inch or 2 inches for an opening, because we want to be able to pull all of that fabric inside out, and then that's going to create our scrunchie. So go into that opening and pull all of that fabric out, and then now you have this little tube, and then what we're going to do is we're going to add our elastic. I use 9mm knitted elastic for all of my scrunchies, and you can do this 2 ways. You can either just wrap it around your wrist twice, or wrap it around once and then double that up, and that will be your elastic for it. Or I usually do about 10 to 12 inches. I did 12 inches for this scrunchie, but I probably could have done a little bit shorter because it ended up being not as fluffy as I wanted it to be, but that's fine. So I cut out 12 inches, and then you'll put a safety pin on the end of your elastic, and we're going to thread that through the hole. Make sure that you don't lose the other end and that doesn't go on the inside, because otherwise you will have to redo this again. Once you get to the end, you can take out that safety pin, and then you can either finish this 2 ways. You can put those 2 pieces of elastic over the top of each other and sew a zigzag stitch, or I just normally tie about 2 or 3 knots in the end and make sure that it's nice and tight, and I find that this is perfectly fine. It's really secure and you don't feel it when you're wearing it either. Cut off any excess, and then now we're going to close up that opening like what we did with the tote bag. So you're just going to make sure those raw edges are flicked onto the inside of the scrunchie. Pin it in place if you need to, otherwise just sew about a 1/2 centimeter along that edge there, back tacking and cutting off any of the excess thread, and then now you have your scrunchie. Okay, now that we're done with the tutorials, I've saved the most important stuff to last. Let's talk about cleaning our machines. Now, each machine is different, so do reference your manual for all of the oiling and care methods for your individual machine. But basically, when we're using our machine, obviously there's going to be a lot of dust and just lint that gets built up in our machines, and we need to make sure that we're cleaning them regularly. basically after every project that we're doing, or every single day if we're using it every single day, because there's going to be a lot of lint buildup, dust, and obviously your machine also needs to be oiled as well to make sure that it's running smoothly. If you're someone who is just using your machine every so often, you don't have to do this as often, but I still recommend just making sure that you're cleaning out the lint and everything that gets stuck in there after your projects, because this can also cause your fabrics to get caught and your bobbin and your threads to just get all tangled up and everything in there. And sometimes it can also cause the lint to actually come up from underneath the machine and get stuck into your fabrics, and then you have to unpick and re-sew over that. Make sure you refer to your machine's manual for where you have to oil your machines, as each sewing machine is different, and the main place that most should be getting oiled though is the bobbin casing underneath the plate. You'll need to remove the plate and casing and clean up any thread or dust or lint that's under there, because this can affect your sewing projects. And then once it's done, take an earbud and dip it into a pea-size amount of sewing machine oil. Make sure you are only using sewing machine oil to clean your machines. Wipe this around there so that your bobbin spins nicely, and then I also put a little bit on like the needle shaft arm, because this moves regularly too. You should also get your sewing machines professionally serviced at least once a year if you're using it regularly, or even more if you're doing it for a business, because there's a lot of grease that they need to put into the machines to make sure that it runs smoothly. They can also troubleshoot any problems that you may not have been able to see in your machines from just your regular sewing. Lastly, let's talk about fabrics and sewing patterns. So there's thousands of sewing patterns available online, and I sell some of my own sewing patterns from my brand, mostly my old designs, and I'm slowly adding more throughout the months as they come. They do just take quite some time to make, but I'm trying to get through them. I do have a lot that I want to release this year, but please be patient with me. I'm doing my best. If it's your first time sewing, then I recommend sticking to beginner friendly sewing patterns. I have a few available if you want to try doing garments. So the April top and April dresses are my most popular ones at the moment, and they're my favorite pieces to make, and they are super easy to make as well. And if you're a beginner, they're great to work with. If you don't want to jump into making garments straight away, I would recommend making some easy things like the tote bag that we did in this video, some scrunchies. You could also make pillowcases. Just have a practice of some things that are a bit more easy while you get the hang of understanding sewing patterns. I also recommend sticking to woven fabrics to begin with, because they are just so much easier to work with. So they are like your poplins, cotton, linen, rayon, those types of fabrics that don't have stretch along the grain lines. They just have that stretch on the diagonal bias. You can jump into working with knits if that's something that you're wanting to do, maybe like swimwear and those types of things, because they're stretch fabrics, but they are a lot harder to work with, and I would recommend probably getting an overlocker to work with a lot of those fabrics, because it just makes it so much easier. But definitely stick to wovens, and then once you get the hang of wovens, then you can jump into working with knits, because they are a little bit harder to work with. They slip, and yeah. Before you go and order a crazy amount of fabric and spend hundreds of dollars on materials, I highly recommend going into a fabric store and seeing what fabrics they have available and getting a feel of fabrics and understanding the different types that there are. You can also go online and do some research into the different kinds of fabric, understanding how they're made, their weights, those types of things. But I highly recommend going into a physical shop and feeling fabric, because looking online, you just don't understand the texture, you don't understand how it flows, how it feels. You might see something online and you think that it's, you know, thicker or it's a bit heavier, but then you get it and it's a lot thinner. So I highly recommend doing that. If you don't have any fabric stores nearby you, or you don't like the fabric that those stores have, then definitely jump online and look at a few fabric stores. I've got a list of fabric stores that you can shop from in Australia that's pinned on my TikTok page, so you can go and check that out if you're wanting to look at those. They're more like natural fabric sort of shops and dead stock fabric shops as well, but you can go on there and you can order fabric samples from them, and then at least you can get a feel of what those fabrics are like and understand the weights and the transparency and those types of things. Buying fabric samples is also really helpful if you're starting a business. I have a giant box of fabric samples upstairs from everything that I've collected over the last 6 years of sewing, and it's just always good to go back and just refer to those fabrics and get a feel of different fabrics and see what you like and what you don't like, and understanding the colors and all of those types of things. So I think it's super important to get fabric samples. Even if you don't end up buying that fabric, you can at least have them there and you can just refer back to them, and then maybe in the future you might end up doing something with those fabrics. If you're unsure of how much fabric to buy for your sewing projects, most patterns should have the amount of fabric that you'll need, and typically I always try to add an extra like 50 centimeters to 1 meter, or if I'm wanting to do a lot more pieces out of it, then I'll add more. But typically if I'm buying something and I'm making a pattern for myself or just making a smaller sort of one-off item, I'll buy what the pattern says plus an extra 50 centimeters to 1 meter, just in case I make a mistake or I decide that I want to add something to it, or I need to just have an extra bit of fabric to use. It's really annoying when you get to the end of a sewing project and you've realized you've made a mistake, but you don't have any more fabric available to fix it. Maybe it was dead stock, or maybe the supplier doesn't sell it anymore, or you just can't get your hands on that type of fabric. So it's always a good idea to just buy a little bit extra just in case of mistakes. Or also, some fabrics are different widths, so your length is obviously going to be however much you wanted. If you wanted 3 or 4 meters, then that's the length, but your width of your fabric depends on the type of fabric you buy and then the supplier or manufacturer and how much they make them. But most fabrics are about 140 to 180 centimeters in length. Some are a little bit longer, some are a little bit shorter, it just depends. But sometimes you buy fabrics and you can't use the whole width, you have to use the length, but then you end up using more fabric. So make sure that you buy just that little bit extra just in case of those issues. And then if you ever have any leftover fabrics, you can always use them for other scrap fabric projects. You can make pencil cases, you can make scrunchies, you can make smaller products, you can wrap gifts in them. It depends on what it is or what type of fabric it is, and you can just do so much with your scrap fabrics, especially if they're like at least a decent amount of size as well. You can also do patchwork clothing, that's something to do, or you can make bags, all sorts of different things. So it's always good to just have that little bit extra, and then you can also just use it. Or if you decide that you don't want to use it, you can always donate it or give it to someone else who may want to use it in their sewing projects. When you're cutting out your sewing patterns, you usually have an arrow indicating the grain line on your fabrics. So for woven fabrics, you have a grain line going lengthways and widthways. So like this, basically. Hopefully you can see it, but basically this is the grain. It's kind of easy to see on woven fabrics which way they go. It's basically just straight up and down. Those are your grain lines. And for woven fabrics, they don't have much give in those grains. They might have a tiny bit of give on one of the directions, but most of the time they won't really stretch at all. Whereas with knit fabrics and stretch fabrics, most of them either stretch like 2 ways or they'll stretch 4 ways. You will though have stretch in the bias, and the bias is pretty much the diagonal. Knit fabrics are a little bit different because they have stretch going across the grains. So the straight grain is the series of loops that runs parallel to the selvage, and the cross grain is the loops in that knit. The selvaged edge of a fabric is this part here, and as you can see, it's kind of got a sort of like different, I guess, coloring sort of feel to it. Basically just something that's put there so that the fabric doesn't fray. So you've got all of this frayed bit here, but it won't come out anymore. So if this was just left normally, it'll fray like how this is gone, like that, if that was just left without this selvage bit here. Typically when you're cutting your patterns, you want to make sure that you're not going over that sort of line there, if you can see it. So that sort of part. If you're using printed fabric, there's normally like a distinct line, so it's normally printed on like a white fabric, and then you may have like a blue print or something going across there, and you'll just have this white strip down the edge, so it's more distinct and noticeable. So you can just cut that off and discard of that, or you can use it in something else. I'm not sure if you would like to, but you can use it for another project. But Most of the time the selvage edge, you won't use it in your projects, and if you're cutting your patterns, you want to make sure that you're not going past that sort of line there in the fabric, because otherwise you get that on your garments and it'll look kind of funny. Finally, we have the two different sides of fabric. So I don't have any patterned fabric here with me, but basically if you ever are watching a sewing tutorial or something online, or you read a sewing pattern or anything, you'll hear them referring to the good side of the fabric and the wrong side of the fabric. Basically the good side of the fabric is the good side, so this is the side that's going to be worn on the outside. You're going to see it. This will probably be the side that has a pattern on it if you're using something that has a pattern, and then the wrong side is the side that doesn't have the pattern on it, or is the side that's going to be on the inside of the garment. When you're working with fabrics such as like linen or just a plain fabric, and it doesn't really show any difference on either side unless it's got like a shine to one side or something like that, or maybe one side has more like texture to it or anything like that, then it doesn't really matter what side you're working with. Just make sure that you're using the right pieces of your pattern and sewing them together. But if you're working with these types of fabrics, it doesn't particularly matter too much what sides of the pattern is your good side and your wrong side, because both sides should look pretty much the same. But if you're working with something that has a pattern on it, maybe you've got some printed fabric and one side has a print on it and then the other side is like a white or some sort of like faded wash of the print, then you'll distinctly be able to see the good side and the wrong side. So make sure that you're sewing those the correct way, because you don't want to get to the end of your sewing and find that you've sewn back to front and got the outside on the inside and all jumbled up. Okay, that brings us to the end of this video. Wow, thank you so much for coming along this journey. It was a big video and I hope that you guys enjoyed it. I'm going to give you guys a little discount for making it to the end of this video, so you can use the code YouTube10 for 10% off at the checkout, and this is across my whole website. So if you want to use it on sewing patterns or my garments that I make for you, you can do that. Thank you guys so much for being here. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to comment them down below, or you can send me a message on Instagram and I'll try and get back to you as quickly and as best as I can. Plus, if you make any of my garments or anything from this video, or you ever buy a sewing pattern from me, or you ever buy one of my garments that I make for you, please don't forget to tag me at inmay_the_label on Instagram or TikTok. I can't wait to see you in your inmay pieces. It seriously makes me so happy seeing them. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you in the next one.